Presenting now is Claudio Ramirez-Uribe. At the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, Spain, he earned his PhD in Musicology 2024. His dissertation regarding Villancico de Negro y Negrillas obtained the highest grade cum laude and the international mention. His published research focuses on the African musical diaspora in the Americas and cultural identities in Latin America. He was granted the PAME GDUAL International Scholarship for Field Research in Colombia 2017. As a visiting graduate researcher, he conducted part of his research at UCLA, USA 2022, and UNAM, Mexico 2023. Currently, he is working on a postdoctoral project financed by SECHITI, Mexico, at Instituto de Investigaciones Antropológicas, UNAM. He will be presenting Researching the African Influence in Mexican Music, Dialogues Between Past and Present.
Hello, can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm gonna share my presentation. Are you able to see the presentation? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for accepting my contribution for this conference. I am eager to know what you think about this conflict between African and Mexican music. So I'll start. Since the 1990s, the interest in research in the African Afrodescendant element in Mexican music has increased. However, back in the early decades of the 20th century, while describing a censored dance from the late 18th to the early 19th centuries, the Jarabe Gatuno, Saldívar indicated his possible African influence, although he left it to posterity to confirm such an assumption. In the last decade of the same century, researchers such as Pérez Fernández, Aguirre Beltrán, and Chamorro Escalante, among others, pushed forward from musicological and historical fronts to identify elements of African traits within the multicultural panorama of living traditional music in Mexico and in Spain, colonial Mexico. Following the research, the development of musical repertoires linked to an African Afrodescendant present goes back to the early 16th century, to the very first contact between indigenous populations of Mesoamerica and the Spanish culture, already highly mixed with Sephardic, North African, Islamic, Romani, and Sub-Saharan African elements. Likewise, the systematic transatlantic slave trade brought hundreds of thousands of African people to the Viceroyalty of New Spain, most of them from West Bantu origins, but also from Senegambia, the Gulf of Guinea, and Mozambique. Around the mid-17th century, in larger urban centers such as Mexico City and Puebla de Los Angeles, the freed and enslaved Africans and Afro-descendants organized Catholic religious celebrations known as oratorios, novenarios, or conventículos. As indicated by Lay Marie and Vera, such events might have been religious only as a facade. Instead, they were identified as popular secular celebrations involving festive harp and guitar music and dances, along with the enjoyment of food and beverages such as hot chocolate. Around the same epoch, Fray Gregorio Argaiz wrote, while living in Spain, about the cultural importance and collective agency of the Black population in Puebla. Argaiz not only indicated the large number of them, but also how they danced and played music during festive days in Puebla's public spaces. From hegemonic channel, the religious villancico, perhaps the most important poetical musical genre of the Spanish Empire, assimilated Black cultural elements since the early 16th century. Villancicos de Negro, also called Negrillas, Sanguineos, were examples of the stereotypical depiction with levels of actual cultural realities of the Black population in Hispanic American worlds, both in musical and lyrical levels, with a particular way of pronouncing Spanish, known as habla vozal or habla de negro, and possible quotations of dancers related to the Afro-descendant experience of the modernity, such as Guineo, Cumbe, Sarabanda, Sarandeque, etc. Recent research conducted by Morales Abril, Chavez Bárcenas, Jones, Weissman, Kashner, Pujol, and Finley studies this repertoire from literary, historical, and musicological perspectives. The predominant discussion involves the levels of parity within the Black stereotype and whether there are traces of Afro-descendant agency and resistance in this repertoire. Despite being indoctrination and alienation tools, Villancicos de Negro do seem to reflect the complex environment around these populations. In the case of New Spain, Puebla's chapel masters, Gaspar Fernández and Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla, composed two of the most significant repertoires of Villancicos de Negro, mostly from Christmas and Corpus Christi celebration. It is also important to mention that both of them owned enslaved Africans from Angola and Afro-descendants born in New Spain, and related the work with Afro-descendant musicians and singers in Puebla's cathedral, Juan de Vera, an enslaved Black singer musician, and Luis Barreto, a freed from slavery mulatto singer. Considering the colonial musical repertoire that existed with first-generation Africans in New Spain, nowadays Mexico, such as Negrillas, and the possible oral tradition manifestation, I believe it is fundamental to understanding the musical links that echo the Afro-descendant past into the present-day Mexican musical complex. I employ a diachronic comparison led by a transdisciplinary methodology. This perspective is informed by historical musicology, ethnomusicology, literary and oral tradition study. My research objects are a selection of Mexican songs extracted from the Western Mariachi Tierra Caliente and the Gulf of Mexico Jarocho traditions, and a villancico de negro composed by Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla from Puebla's Christmas festivities of 1658, Negrilla, Dúo y Seis, La Chiquillo de Puntillo. I mostly rely on two theoretical perspectives: the concept of war chord developed by Prince's oral history theory and its adaptation to music studies, the musical chord. This theoretical tool, and I quote, identifies melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic traits that establish a sense of continuity in musical cultures, particularly in oral tradition, end quote. Thus becomes a musical example of what youthfully identified as the indiciary paradigm. And two, the concatenation of musicological, ethnomusicological theories around African music and its diaspora in America. To conduct such a diachronical approximation, I mainly rely on theories proposed by researchers from or dedicated to African and Latin American Afro-descendant music, such as the Women, Akpabo, Pérez Fernández, Inquietia, Agawu, Mukuna, Chamorro Escalante, and Kubik, among others. I organized their perspective on one proposal of reorganization levels of analysis in West Central African music, the backbone structure, the middle ground, and the foreground level. By doing so, I aim to identify musical chords related to African music and music identified as Afro-descendant in present-day Mexico, along with the 17th century Negrillas that seemingly depict parodical elements of Afro-descendant Mexican culture. The backbone structure describes the organizing elements of music at a broad level, such as textures, melodic movements, and voice organization. Two examples are the hocket and the call and response movement. But the Weme and Akpa would identify the latter as one of the most important structural configuration elements in West African music and singing. The call and response between soloists or a group of soloists and a larger ensemble of voices is usually organized with musical elements extracted from the soloist singing, the exact reproduction of such singing, or entirely new material. What makes such an element so important for the organization of music discourse is its regularity and the balance between the participation of the soloist and the choir. One part complements the other and provides it with meaning. Pérez Fernández identifies the calling response in El Coco, a traditional song Jarocho named after a local bird. In this example, the response limits intervention to the word coco, alternating with the soloist verse. A similar example occurs in Gutiérrez de Padilla's 1658 Negrillas. In the responsión, or chorus, the whole ensemble takes part in two distinguishable groups: a duo, the call, At all the voices, they respond. A headless four-note gruppetto organizes the entire texture. The particular African trait is similar to the European antiphon texture and the polychord technique of the 17th century Hispanic Catholic music. Possibly the chapel masters and poets identified the African colon response and adapted it to fit into their musical culture. Along with the colon response, it is not noticeable how the villancico refers to popular dances in Hispanic American context. Chacona and Sarabanda, named Suribanda or Suribandilla in the text. Likewise, contemporary literature in the 16th to the 17th centuries links it with the Afro-descendant experience in both sides of the Atlantic. It seems that even the Negrillas text referred to the actual interpretation of the Sarabanda via onomatopoeia. The black characters agree on how they will strum, chan chan chan, walk, tin tin tin, and hit tumbukutu, the guitar as they perform in front of an imaginary scene. The rhythmic patterns in all three cases is a clear tweak to a viola. However, when the villancico actually mentions the sarabanda along with the chacona, such pattern becomes more complex. It has a headless start and permanently presents a recurrent rhythmic cell or musical chord, almost identical to Esquerro's description of historical sarabandas. A possible mention of a sarabanda musical chord in Negrilla, Duo y Acefa Siquio Puntilla, introduced the poem's second analytical letter, the middle bar. This element approaches the metric organization in music. Thus, it is fundamentally understanding how Africans and Afro-diasporic traditions create, preserve, and adapt musical chords, meaning melodic patterns, rhythmic cycles, etc. Following Mukuna, in the Americas context, the adaptation and continuity of the plural African mentalities led into creating and innovating musical products into their new social geographical surroundings. The temporary pattern, ostinati or clave, are fundamental since they not only organize music, but also aid in unify, preserve, and adapt Afro-descendant traits in relation with different cultural elements. I am approaching two particular components identified in the middle ground: the additive pattern, or APs, and the emiola. While doing so, I consider Agabu's reflection on African rhythm and the historical European misconception around African music as a single universe. Inquietia supports the idea of the complex and plural realities in the African panorama. However, here he identifies certain similarities between ethnic groups that share geographical spaces and cultural links across history. Acknowledging this discussion, I focus my approach to the African areas most related with the transatlantic slave trade and New Spain in the modernity, meaning West Central Africa, mainly Congo and Angola, and the Gulf of Guinea. Kubik clarifies that the APs are particularly present in those same areas, with some manifestations in Southeast Africa, the Valley of Zambezi and Gobumba. Following the same author, the organizing actors in African music, with the involvement of dancing, performing, and communal participation, is a constant element both constructed by a cycle of beats, performed by hand clapping, beat stamping, rattles, a bass drum, etc. Supporting this perspective, Agabu highlights the importance in multiple African cultures of fixed musical cycles highly related with dancing, not just as performance organizers, but also because they are mnemonic devices for serving musical thinking and engaging with the listeners' minds. One of the most common are the 12-4 cycles organized in two interchangeable parts of 5 and 7 beats. Kubik identified as such cycles, and quote, often reinterpreted by Western trainers observers as 12/8 time, and quote, were preserved by Afro-descendants in the Americas and adapted to Western musical instruments like guitars during the slavery period to present days. Up next, I list examples of extracted from the Buenos and Agabu's research of such APs. One of the most important 12-fold cycles is the so-called timeline pattern by Kubik, standard pattern by Pérez Fernández and Agabu, and bell rhythm by Akpabot, since he identifies that it is mostly performed by bells, gongs, or the idiophone. A summarize of 12-fold APs, including the standard pattern indicates that. Up next, I present the APs in Gutierrez de Padilla's villancicos. To identify them, I also consider the influence of the Hispanic poetic rhythm. Likewise, in Mariachi and Tierra Caliente music, the bass guitar, or guitarrón, usually constructs its performance in the same AP, 2 plus 2 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2. In this particular case, the AP as a musical core is not only adapted to a type of clock guitar, but also in the constructed in the lower part of the ensemble, which clearly indicates about African APs performed by bass drums. Pérez Fernández identifies another layer in which APs interact with an ensemble. This is when an AP happens simultaneously along with other rhythmic patterns. It seems that Pérez Fernández retakes the previously mentioned concept of spacing. This theoretical tool clarifies how different rhythmic melodic lines vertically overlay on top of each other, sometimes as complements and sometimes diversifying the musical discourse. Following Ketia, the cross rhythm is a musical effect produced by spacing. It explains how different metrics overlap each other. The most common and simple of them is vertical overlap of 2-3 meters, or a vertical eniola. The same example of 2-3 cross rhythm utilized by Ketia appears in traditional Mexican choir performance. One example is the most common accompaniment in Tierra Caliente tradition. It is noticeable that the left hand ostinado is the same one of the guitarrón in mariachi. A second example is the Stampa Jarocha, a song composed by harp for harp by the Jarocho virtuoso Andrés Huesca. The bass line maintains a constant triple meter, while an AP 3 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3 organizes the melody. Thus, the whole composition presents a permanent rhythmic crossing. Both examples also show how eniola allowed musical dialogue. Both examples also show how eniola allowed musical dialogue between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In the 16th and the 17th centuries, musical theories such as Luis de Narváez and Pietro Cerone described the 3-2 eniola or fisquialter in Spanish as a fundamental element in Spanish music. Garcia de Leon proposes Hispanic eniola as an Arabic trait, and later on, due to the close relations with Africa, it mixed with similar sub-Saharan patterns, both in the Iberian Peninsula and the Americas. Nevertheless, Weisman identified the regular appearance of the eniola in several examples of Hispanic American villancicos, not only in Madrid. Thus, for these researchers, it is a common rhythmic resource for composers across the Spanish Empire. Precisely, Bellingham and Russell claim that such rhythmic element is fundamental in popular Hispanic American dances, including Afro-descendant examples such as Sarabanda Cubet. I present a table with excerpts of the eniola extracted from Spain, West Central Africa, and Mexico. Finally, the foreground level consisting of rhythmic variation, decorative musical elements, and it is the first component caught by the listeners. It is fundamental since it refers to the performance experience, the on-site interaction with music, and the levels of cultural creativity allowed by different musical aesthetics. Pérez Fernández and Antropológicas agree on employing the ancient Greek metrical in analyzing different ways on how African Afrodescendant music diversified. For both authors, the fluid additive element provided by the APs and the 14th century poetry and poets in African and Afro-Hispanic music, with a very important element of Spanish poetry from the latter, justifies the use of such a theory. Akbabot identifies a predominant use of the yam for short long in West African music, particularly among Ibibio culture. Pérez Fernández, from a different perspective, identifies more predominantly the trucking to long short in traditional Spanish poetry and music over the yam. Interestingly, Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla handsomely employs the yam for the construction of his territorial century Negrillas. During the modern age, the yam was identified in Europe as a way of portraying otherness in music. However, there is a possibility that such imagined alienated others, meaning Black population in this case, actually organized their music with such an element. Thus, the use of the yam become more of a parody constructed via observing that a sole artistic intellectual European construct. Aside from metrical, there are more ways of diversifying the themes in African music. Akbabot identifies different patterns that vary the bell rhythm, also known as the standard pattern or the timeline. Two of such variants relate to traditional Hispanic and modern age Afro-Hispanic music. Variation J in Akbabot's table relates to how Berlanga identified the distribution of 6th and 12th beats in Hispanic music. Likewise, variation D equally appears in the beginning of Sarabanda's musical. Finally, Pérez Fernández proposed his own list of variations. He labeled them as African Resources of Rhythm Variation, or ARRV. This proposal allows identifying how APs adapt into non-African or Hispanic music to develop new transcultural products. They exist in both Manila and APs and only affect the first part of the parent of music. Up next, I present a table with Pérez Fernández are being highlighted in examples of APs identified in Mexican music from Jarocho and Mariachi tradition. So, in conclusion, the links between the African traditional music from the past and the Hispanic American world were preserved in Mexican traditional music via this musical core. So it is important to create a sensible methodology between historical musicology and ethnomusicology to unravel the links between all these cultures and how they dialogue between the present and the past, especially in regions such as Latin America or Mexico in this case, and Africa, in which oral tradition is so important in constructing cultural realities in our society. So, thank you so much, and I wait for your comments.
And so that we can engage Claudio on his presentation. Do we have any online participants who want to ask questions? Do we have any hand? Okay, let me check the chat box. Okay, so there is a question here. I don't see the name. Oh, Dr. Esuola Adeshola. Thank you, Claudio. How is this African influence sustained, revived, or contested in contemporary Afro-Mexican communities today?
Well, in Afro-Mexican communities that they acknowledge such, for instance, in Veracruz or in Costa Chica, in Oaxaca, they are reconstructing their path, not only for music, but also with dancing and other cultural elements, food, certain words. So the ways being owned or revived is sometimes through rethinking it, and some other times to basically going back to the roots, like researching it. Sometimes from repertoire or cultural elements that are not necessarily in those areas. Like, for instance, most of the musical elements that I present that clearly relate, or we can relate to West African elements, are mostly common in areas that are not considered Afro-Mexican, like Tierra Caliente and Mariachi traditions are from areas more highly mixed, like the African or a darker skin phenotype mixed right from the start, like right from the 16th, 17th century into indigenous and Hispanic ethnic elements. However, the cultural elements prevailed, and now what we're trying to do in Mexican contemporary ethnomusicology and historical musicology is to identify these cultural elements, basically to expand the discussion on what the African heritage is in Mexico. Is it only conveyed or is only preserved in these areas, like these coastline areas, or is also in different cultural elements in the highlands or the innerlands? So, for instance, the largest population of African and Afro-descendants in colonial Mexico was located in urban areas in the center of the country, like Mexico City, Puebla, not in the coastline, right? So the way these communities are trying to reconstruct this path is through a very complex process of rethinking their realities, right? And their history and their memory and their traditions. Mm.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Suola, I hope that answered your question. Okay, he says thank you. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Okay. Could you please give it to Professor Agau first, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that paper. I'm sorry I didn't follow all of the details for various reasons, but I wonder if you could just say something general about this question of survivals of certain essential traits. For example, in one of your early slides, you had call and response as presumably an essential African trait. But of course, it is not a trait restricted to Africa, right? The Christian church has been doing response for a very long time. So I'm just wondering, you know, how can you be sure of the traits and their origins? That's one question. So call and response, or even hemiola, which, you know, we say is an essentialized African thing, but hemiola, of course, is all over medieval, you know, music, for example. But do questions like that bother you? Do they keep you awake at night? Or are you pretty certain of the origins of these traits aligned with regions of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. How can I establish a hypothesis about the African influence? As I said in this, as I said in the presentation, and taking the idea is like a shared element, right, between Western European music, especially religious music, and African Western music. How can I think or make an assumption on this African influence in this particular repertoire? Well, it's because in Negrillas, or in the Villancico de Negro, like this specific subgenre of religious Villancico, Spanish music, that stereotypically depict Africans or African descendants. It's related via parody to their cultural surroundings, right? So the way the call and response is presented in Negrillas, almost specifically in Negrillas, is in a very short intervention of the response. Like the choir usually responds to the soloist in a very short way, and usually recycles soloist material, like they extract some elements and reproduce it almost exactly with harmonization. That's one element. The second one is also that the intervention of the soloist is also short. Like, for instance, in this case, it's like you can see a 12/8 right phrase, or 2, 6, 8 meters bars, and also it's very irregular, right? We can compare this call and response with other religious villancicos depicting other characters, like European characters such as Portuguese, French, Catalonians, The call and response or the antiphon singing is a little different. Like the soloists tend to have like a more individualistic role, let us say. So in the case of how the call and response is depicted in Villancico de Negro, Black Villancico, is similar to what we can identify in Afro-Westward music. For instance, the Coco example. Coco example, the intervention of both the soloist and the choir is very regular and they complement each other. And also the choir takes like the musical intervention from the soloist
Okay,
element, right?
sorry,
So that's a way to identify these differences, right? Although it's sort of like a common trait, as you said.
okay, Claudio, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have.